Okay, you can see my slides?
Yes.
Okay. So we just had a wonderful example of the qualitative and quantitative research methods. So this is an example of quantitative data from Jenny's talk. You can see where she's looking at the the percentage of individuals with certain symptoms of depression. And so we're getting numerical data on these individuals. But in the same study, Jenny also asked these open-ended qualitative questions that provided, in some respects, a deeper investigation of the person's experience. And so this highlights how qualitative and quantitative methods can work together. Now, Jenny's research was descriptive in that it was primarily designed to describe a population of people. So Jenny didn't do an experiment where she manipulated various things. She was purely describing the experience of depression and in Tibetan individuals. And this highlights that descriptive studies can be both qualitative or quantitative. So descriptive studies can be either qualitative or quantitative or both. And this just highlights not only did she get numerical data, but then she was able to graph her data, just showing that you can present these data in different ways. Now, descriptive data has many strengths, but does anyone want to suggest what a limitation of descriptive research is?
The limitations. Questions goroda, questions na yana ko tsedo goroda.
Group 1.
Hello. I think the limitation of descriptive research is that it can't be so much accuracy, lack of accuracy.
Okay. I think I'll complement that by saying a primary limitation of descriptive research is that you can't establish causality.
단다 견하게 소화될 때도 와가서 나다가 속에 때 제집이 시시에다 그 레시피가 시시들로 지금 바나 거기에 다 가서는 딱딱하지 진짜 시작 그말에서 accuracy 시스템을 텐데 뒤쪽에 시작 그말에서 해들어 왔대 시스템을 이제 로빈 라기 때라야 그 가는 지자 바이나 텐데 뒤쪽 시스템이 가서 바나 마속에 진짜 시작이 시시들로 지금 바나 딜라텐데 때 마속에 주탄 리뷰가 좋아지 주어와 어디 또 주트 그말에서
And so if we want to start to establish causality, which we'll talk about in more detail tomorrow, we need to start to think about doing experiments.
다 나속에 그 주탄 리뷰가 좋아지 이야기 내던 때라고 지라야 주는 지구요 바이나 아니 디 마속에 딱시치 두고요 레스탄 되게 텔라 니 주탄 리뷰 거때 아니 가서 그랬다 상인이 진짜 값을 지원도 쓰고 그랬어.
Now, this is a very wordy definition of an experiment, and it includes a number of terms that we'll get familiar with in the next few minutes.
다다 되게 저 다시서 되게 거기 고든들 다 바이바는 지금 보시고 그래서 내나라요 거기 다시게 전부 되나요 같이 지요 그래서 되다 아니 가지고 갈래갈래 아니 decision wins.
And before I move on, I just want to see I increased the font. Are people able to see the Tibetan translation better now, Pasang?
동고도에서 단다데 제속에 보이는 주셔지도 단계 보이게 유지 총다지 통고도 송로와 나다데 길라게 보이게 유지때 칠당샤예스 단다 야고 통고도에서 다파 잘로 안에 야고 통고도.
Yes, we can see it better.
Okay, great.
Much better.
So I'm actually going to wait to go through this definition until we define some of these terms.
다다 되게 가서 그래. 디나나요 비 치카시카시 지금 대신 맞이고 뭐라야로 단다 디나나야 디 가서 디긴 대신데 그 고던데 대신자 가보지도.
And to introduce the logic of experimentation, I want to give you an example of a possible experiment.
다다 되게 가서 딱시에 되게 고던가리 바되게 그거 진선에다 간다로 지금 바디 하고하기 제때 단다 될라게 비천치 시작이스.
So this is a project that I'm involved in with Geshe Lobsang.
다다데 만나 gelage Geshe Lobsang la nyamte ne 주부요 비게 딱시 진지지인스.
And Geshe Lobsang has developed a very well-organized compassion training program for people who don't have a lot of exposure to meditation.
다다 Geshe Lobsang 라게 바나 단다 지금 저기나 지금 검지지야라야 냠냠 매주 고슬라 펜트와기 체도 아니 지금 닌지기 검지가 아니 디나도 지금 드라이어 쪽에 지금 롭좀 디나도 지금 기실라가 아니 담배나 요레스.
And this is a 10-week training program that people can participate in and learn some of the tenets of compassion-based meditation.
다들 바나 그 니만 주스고 다든 저지그랑라야 도시지야요 쪽에 아니 그 리스트에 바간실라 디 값서 소인 바나 가서 닌지사 되게 그런 게 따뜻하던 사실 가리가리 임바티 지롭좀 지트야기 니고 검드기 냠는지레스.
And tomorrow we'll talk about some of the biology that we're collecting on this project. But today I just want to provide a simple kind of possible outcome variable, which is self-reported well-being and happiness.
다 산이 바나가 속에 지금 데이터를 주기 진행단 대위기 내던 tinda 대자긴스 다 되는 바나 아주 데라야 지금 인지 사이트 검지치올라 텐데 데데 아니 가서가 수고 주부게 된 탄당 지금 디지털 소파가 시고로다 데이터 간으로 지금 것도 띄고라는 시작인스.
And so I want to imagine that we're doing an experiment testing whether or not compassion training increases well-being and happiness amongst people who don't have a lot of experience with compassion meditation.
다단데 가서 그쪽에 딱시 드레드가 레스스타발라야 샴 민지게 콜라야 검지치 만용미게 무슨나라야 아니 가리 딱시 지그레서나 검지티 제바이나 아니 그쪽에 지가 디치탄스고라 디치탄 아니 zupugi tretan la sopa chgorwa dintan la sopa te yejin dugdugundu sayate la tsche dress.
Now, when you do an experiment, you typically have a theory, which is a prediction or model of the natural world that you want to test.
다 단데 저런 게 다시치 지구요 바나 다시티 나라야 남셔 세주레스 남셔 티가레스 담발라 저런 게다 초포치 샤주 나중가 나츠치 그걸라야 초포치와 간실라티 저런 거 다시치 니루주게 남셔 치로라테레스.
So whereas descriptive research is more exploratory, where you're just gathering information, in an experiment, you actually have a pre-existent model that you want to examine.
단데 가수게 응을라야 데시지하게 시시치고라 티가레스 담발라 치팅게 바나고 초습지하게 네콘테나로지 차그레스. 단단데 값승아서 딱시 이미 값이 바나 니 저런 거 지금 딱시 리아 주니어 지고라 저타 진이 주야 될라야 당본이 니콜라야 지금 비체마서는 지요레스.
And the goal is to translate your theory into a very specific hypothesis that you can test with your experiment.
단데 디기는 게 무기지 가레스 담발 저런라야 다 지금 남샤치요로 남샤티 아니 그 니땅 이쟁게 나라야 아니 그 딱시지 피하게 아니 초셔라야 주레디나레스.
So the theory tends to be kind of a more overarching model of the world. The hypothesis is the very specific prediction for your specific study.
다디카스 바나가츠가 남샤 사이데카레 시스템을 저런 거 딱시치세데 질라 차피게 그 고란탄도 지금 바이나 되게 나네 아니 최셔 사이데 아니 네탄티게 올라야 믹스타 네탄 체적 빠치라야 저런 거 딱시치니 두야게 네탄틴다라 고 요레스.
So does anyone want to take a stab at defining the hypothesis that we might have on the effect of compassion training on well-being?
단데 카스 바나 지금 나수게 닌지 곰발라텐데로 닌지 그 곰들라텐데 때가 속에 죽고 트레팅 당 지금 디치라야 지 팽거스에 지고로 단다 되게 네탄 되게 간라야 아니 지 철샤 지 돈이 된다 요에사.
It's going to be a very simple sentence.
네, 그 스크립트마서 스크립트 답되어지레스.
먼저 인제당 의 잠재기 코르티치기 고소소기 셈낭지 양내양의 삼로땅와이나 소소기 직셈낭기 강일 된 용도 줘야를 직편도 지무도 거와.
네.
베르나지 디게디 아니 곰바이나 고 야르게 줘야디 교바 텐텐지레 베르나로 간조 모터 장겐지기 코 모터디 가주기 코 장바이나 코 베트 갈스고레 모터 장에디 코 장마 차야 당 디게 요러와.
네.
디인중하는 손님제 당 잠재디게 가제기 직소소기 직 금진디게 삼모당치 곰바이나 고 공벨도야 야루야루 줘야 요레스. 남시직라니 갈스고레 자니 공모고에 행계기 통내니 갈수록 용해디니 요레스. 어디니 쉬어야.
That's all. Yeah, his suggestion is love and compassion is something that we can practice. You hear me?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, love and compassion is something that we can practice and improve. It's like if we start learning driving. Sometimes it becomes automatic that you can become an expert, something like that. Also, like if you practice compassion and love more, sometimes it will become a natural to you, and it happens naturally within you. So that is some skill that you can practice and develop.
Perfect. So the way that we could define that as a hypothesis is with this very simple statement that compassion training increases well-being.
단단하게 단단 gelag somebati la shisha de tang atsu chosha tabdi chi karichina de kres tambalaya ani ninji saeti nyamlan chola tene de te atsu ge chi choage ta chi ti chorwa ta de thang chi gorwa ta well-being ro lunkamni ge den thang chi gorwa ti la ya yerjen do kres ti shana de kres.
So the hypothesis is defined very specifically in this experiment. So we would say that compassion training increases self-reported well-being using the measure that we would administer to people that measures well-being.
다 단다디 가서 말한 속에 다 저셔서 되게 좀 믹스까지 지시고 왔다 단다디 피셔샤 바이나 단다디 네탄데라야 가속에 닌지 곰발라테네 데티 닌지 곰캥기 민테 딱나라야 네치 수수게 지 디지털 지가 rinsamgi dentang chorwa ti yejin dugre se ti muske de ti ni decision de cores.
Now maybe you can get a flavor of the third person nature of this experiment, because we're not doing the practice ourselves as the researcher. We're watching other people do it and seeing if it affects their well-being. That's the kind of the difference between the first and third person experience.
Ahada ote tampotileti chesha tian kare system bala sosu ngone self reported sigwa sosu ngone chi dewa dina du pudia du chu du sa chorwa netan tin sta bala mi tampo kansa tampo ti nyo ngone de sija gorwa eti gala ya kansa tampo ti gala ya nga su kansa simba chi ke tatange netan te ko khanu china de kores picha shapana mi chi ke kitine chiwa ta ti ge netan te la ya ani chinga su tashi chi de te ko tu chi chi de te ko kansa tampo tan kansa simba ge So
the very famous philosopher of science, Karl Popper, says that for a hypothesis to be scientific, it has to be falsifiable. That is, you have to be able to prove it false in an experiment.
That's
why it's hard to examine the question, for example, does God exist scientifically? Because it's hard to disprove that hypothesis.
That because in Bana and then also Jikin Kobo Yoreo Maris, Toatina do in Bana, Harry Taxela and the Deco, Ratuchi Capuchi or Scarcilla Bana, Kumain by Giratuchi Boras, Nor Tua Drugu or Tua Dreati Capuchi Boris.
Now, in order to do an experiment and test a hypothesis, we need to manipulate things in order to try to establish causality.
Tanga suga taxi dribi capsules or taxi dribi taxi dirty that the treasure chilaya and you could drigdum do say dribgu yena, take up some suga and a nani kashichilaya, juratang de one, juratang segura, the manipulates net double jitang de Nengasuge, Jutan Jivugi, Jawati Tikundum do tabu is.
And something that we manipulate in an experiment is called a variable.
That Anangasuga Tashin Jikan in Juratayagi, Juratans and Jujiagi, Giora, Jujiatelaya, Persegresna, and Jutantan and Juchisegres.
Now, there's different types of variables that are important to define to understand the scientific method.
That Taxi, Tablet Nala Yang Asungi, Kashichuretelaya, and the Jutain by an Juchin by Nanko, Jumando Kashiores.
So the first and very important definition is what's called an independent variable. So in an experiment, an independent variable is very important.
That in an Asun Jutan Kashicho being on a catch, Shishikari system, but let to make in Jutan Satis, Taxation Jichi, Capsule, Jutan Sag in Jutandi, which in Kitchenbuchi Chagris.
So an independent variable is the part of the experiment that you intentionally manipulate in order to test the effect on your outcome variable.
That under the Capsule Bana, to make in Jutan Satis and a Taxation Jichikan to check the God that Kolaya and Juratang Juratanga data, and you call Tamagi and Jutan Segurata, Jimjig in Jutan, Delaya, and you cook is which take do Mendusa, Tach or Changot and Juratang, and Jutan de la Kuguyores.
So the independent variable in our experiment could be whether or not somebody does the compassion training.
That under Nasuki Taxation Beauty Caps, and a to make in Jutons, to make in Juchitica system, Laya, Michiki, any Ninji, Gomdrin, Yamlinchi, do Medusa, Nico to make in Juchitichagares.
So we would have two levels of the independent variable. One is a group of people who do the compassion training, and the other is a group of people who don't.
Da di kapsin ba na nga so time gen juche de la ya rumba ni yores chikar la sambala ya de ninji te gomri chini ge din sentere chite ninji te gomri michini ge din senteres.
And that would allow us to test whether the compassion training causally increases well-being.
Da tela ten ba na nga sin di shisha ba na de nga so la ya ane chi ninji te ko gomri chiwala ten de te nga so ge zu ge din thang sa ko da lisem ge din thang te la ya ane shu chen tek du mundu sa chi ko wa te ane thache la pantro chi res.
Now, in order to test the effect of compassion training on well-being, we have to actually measure well-being.
Nga so de la ya ninji gi nyamlen chiwala ten de te nga so ge chi din thang sa ko de la ya ko shu chen tek du mundu sa ti ha ko la ya hamatela nga so kar chi ko res na yosam ge din thang chi ko de chen je gu yo res.
Now, there's many ways that we can measure well-being, and that's a very important decision for the researcher as to what's the best measure for well-being in this specific study.
Here
we're going to use a self-report questionnaire that gives you a numerical number of somebody's well-being based on their self-reported questionnaire. But we could have many different dependent variables depending on what our question was. So for example, we could say, maybe we think compassion training increases physical health. And then we could have, some measure of physical health, and that would be the dependent variable. Or we could ask whether or not compassion training changes the brain. And then the brain would be the dependent variable. And I'll show you some data later this week when we discuss the neuroscience of emotion, showing that compassion changes the brain in very meaningful ways. Now, an important part of an experiment is having a control condition, which is some condition that you're comparing the compassion training to. So you could think of the control condition as the baseline to which you're comparing your manipulation. And there's many ways you could define the control condition. So in our study, it could be a group of people who doesn't do any compassion training. Or it could be a group of people who do, say, a mindfulness training, and we could test whether or not compassion increases well-being more than mindfulness.
예, 현대적 가르타는 그래서 담발아야 그 아주 땅인증 고민이지거라 루치치도 점이야기 이 곰티 장이야기 된센치라타는 그래서 텔레데도 담아들랑 아속에 니치 잠깐 인지 곰바임바이나 되게 아주 강디 벤탄데 아니 지가 루치치 좀 쓰고라 땅인증 곰바텔레 지 슈쳐도 사야지거라 되거라야 세제네드 거레스.
The point is that as you, the researcher, you're the one determining and making all these decisions. You're saying, what's the best way to try to determine whether or not my independent variable affects my dependent variable?
단다 데이터 그 가서부터 슈친티 가나도 중종 만종 사이즈로 다시 되게 나라야 또 담하게 터 제니티스에서는 다시 됩니다. 내값이 최초 이번에 최초 레스 다시 됩니 시주 차거레스 디 가리 터지고요레서나 다 두메긴 주장 찍어와 두메긴 주장 데이터라 때네 데이터니 두지긴 주장 데라야 슈친 가는 스프레그도 트리트먼트 사이즈로 다디 다시 드피 값이 아니 그거 세 야슈치스 거라 네탄테나 중종알아 답시는 거이레스.
So with those definitions now in mind, hopefully we have a better sense of this definition of an experiment.
다단다 되게 특히 가시시킨 레시티션 성화데 좀 받다 지금 하고 이간에 단단한 수가 뜻이세 되게 거기 고ton텔라 타바이마나 지치나 대용 고ton테 니와데스 누아탄 카스오요 그레스
which is the controlled test of a hypothesis, which we now know a hypothesis is your predicted outcome.
다단데 값을 조절시켜 걸어 디지게 당진 특별히 초대 지기스고 레스 다단데 값이 많아 단데 지수고야 최시가 단다게 컨트롤 그룹스고라다 당진기로 카테고리 하고 그레스.
And in order to establish causality, you manipulate the independent variable, which in our example is compassion training, either the presence or absence of compassion training.
다단데 값은 속에 디지고요라다 다 주당 젠라텐데 데이터 그 준비 토마토 쓰고라 다 다시 가서 가서 드메긴 주장치라 네고 저랬던 거고요라 니카심바나 단단가 쓰고 딱세테 값을 지금 샴탄인지 gond리 지금 요메세티 차고리스.
And then you measure the effect of that independent variable, here being compassion training, on your dependent variable, which here we're defining as well-being.
단단히 딜라텐데 따라와 단단가 쓰고 드메긴 주장테까지 시스템발라야 드메긴 주장테 샴탄인지 고마곤티와 딜라텐데 데이터 슈친테 뒤지긴 주장가라야 슈친 tek도무도 세테 뒤지긴 주장테 가서 됨바 딘탕사 됨바 어디 간다로 주시 tek도무도 세테레스.
And given this is a quantitative measure, we can get numerical data and test the magnitude or how strong the effect is on somebody's well-being.
단단데 게티 가서가 딱시 심지지야 되로와 벌써가 심지진비 와도 당나 벌써가 심지 장투시라 그러와 장투 데이터라 텐데데 니 슈친티기 체도 간다로 지레샤 니고 망로 가서지샤사야 되지거와 단단가 속에 조데 잠깐 인지 곰발라테니 인지 곰발라테니데 미게 된탕라야 슈친 대기 체가 조지르도 대체제는 거레스.
Now, a very important part of science is what's called replication.
다 찬리게 그게 딱세기나네 그 접착해 지시지가레 시스템발라 제신지야데레스.
In science, we typically don't trust just one observation.
다 찬리기나네 바나 그서 지 다시 깡지라야 이치 지금 말레스.
We want to see if that observation repeats itself in different people, in different settings, and under different conditions.
다 그서 임바나 다시 지 종사주대로와 네탄탄 간사탄 지 그리 만다고 올라 드바이나 가랑지 중국도무도 세테 다야티케 지기요레스.
So science is a very skeptical enterprise because it says I need to see proof and then I need to see proof multiple times before I start to believe it.
다 찬리 임바나 그 가서 그랬다 skeptical system 발anga 속에 지금 동지진이지 와와 삼는 거네 기순 신이게 된다로게 지금 초파도지 차거레스. 가리치그레 시스템 발라야 nga trimdi tinde chi thonyi tugu trimdi te ko thoma chi tsama ba yangsi trimdi chi ba chi chang thomba chi thonyi tugu segres.
And I want to close these comments with a point, which is that science is not a product, it's actually a particular way of thinking.
다 단다 데이터 텐데 길에 디케제 디시시긴 집당인 바나 생리 사이트 탐이 듬지지 말이스 데고 삼루 땅땅 지그레스 생리 사이트
There are an infinite number of variations of science depending on the questions and the methods and the populations that are being examined.
다 저와 땅땅 지거로 와다가 속에 지 딱시 지 땅땅 지 삼땅 데이터라 텐데 데 아니 지 생리 사이트라 양고기 나라야 챕터 만들어드는 망보용 그레스
But the central tenet of science is that you put forth a hypothesis, which is a very specific prediction based on theory.
다 지야 그 생리 그다 직답이 인부들라 샤바이 바이나 아니 그 그다 지 저런 거 남자 지기 난시 예진지라 돈비기 아니 지 초저지가 간라 덕시데디레스
You test that hypothesis using an experiment.
다 저런 거 덕시지 아니 가서 그래 저런 거 저샤티 레 도문도 데라 쳤다 주고 그래서
You collect data and report your conclusions.
아니 단다 지금 덕시티 줄데 땅땅도 들으지야 땅땅도 들으지니 제라야 수수 다듬 가르치기 니송데 무토지고 그래서
And those conclusions generate more questions.
다 저를 듬지지 니던지 라거와 니던 데라 텐데데야 좋아 망보지 그래서
And so we never arrive really at the end of science because the one conclusion just initiates a new question. And that to me is the beauty of science, is it's always about asking the next question.
That's it. Nindado can they don't let anything Asula draw Thomas at on jewel head in the Yomaris that is Gillets on by Bana Tsering on it. Gila Pichas and Jivi Chaticadulas Tambalaya. Oku Tatunchi Kore Tatunchi Patilet and draw mouse Chinjongoris. This Tambalaya ko Tamagatua Dere said you let on your Maraco, Sanitico, method and drew the bachiris.
And this is summarized nicely by Anil Seth, who's a neuroscientist who studies consciousness, who says one of the more beautiful things about the scientific method is that it's cumulative and incremental.
Ponsok take say any urgent Ruguchiwati, and it's Henry Chat on Yanji Chachis.
Okay, thank you. I'm turn it over to Nicole.
So to Jace.
So with our remaining time this evening, we're going to do two things. One is we're going to look at a little bit of data that we have already collected as a group, and think about some of the limitations of those data and what we've learned so far. And then we're going to talk about the short projects that you're going to do as groups, because tomorrow morning you're going to need to you're going to have to define the question that you're going to study and your approach, whether you're going to do a descriptive study or an experimental study.
Tandage total how much or de Casanga Netan Chilatagi instru, Netan Chica system, Balamasu Tantuchi Durichi or Pateg Netantela Canado Jimba, Deti Tagins, anybody Caritagan system Valaya, and a Chinasuge, Taxichi Tripi Capsa Charange, Taxete, and Jeju get Taxichi Chigimbe, Yana, Carsagore. 아니 심지 다 탁시지하게 당도 주기 탁시지기인데 그때 딱 인스티카르라 바이나 아니 단다게 디콜라 칼렌더시 자기인데 산이 제수 쇼바 지 나올리 드비아치도 같이 갑서야 제수게 이거 관계지 드비 터치고 요레스.
So this morning you interviewed each other about sleep and did sort of a qualitative approach to understanding each other's sleep.
다른 쇼파인 반에 제주가 미 판선라에 니게 콜라 좋아지 좋아대양 가리 콜라 좋아지 요레스나 가리 땅 좋아지 스타발랑 아소게 디 비체 땅 좋아요 비게 좋아지 트데 땅 제주라 디고게 니땅 지라 요레스.
Rob and I also sent out a link to a survey that 25 of you have completed on sleep to get some quantitative data.
again Robin ngarani bane chetsula ya twa thongtho yo chu dina chi ta yes ti na ne chetsu mi ni senga ge ani dus len chen sha sticker system bala ya nga chu ni tang te tok tan tyo yo pi ge twa kha chi re ti ma na ya tang tu te ya nga chu borse shin ji tan de tang tu de che che ta ba chi yes.
And for many of your projects that you do in the next couple of days, you may be designing a survey like this.
좀 전적으로 이마 가시나 들 제주 드야게 도시신지티 값이 많아 배치 제주게야 디너도게 지금 좋아 통통여 주고 디너도 주고 그랬어.
So in this survey, we had usually you'll have a lot of different questions, and here we have a set of questions on sleep about how many times people slept during the day, how long they sleep at night, and how often they have a hard time sleeping at night.
Tanda di bana nga su chitang ga tse dire ro tru ka su twa mampu chang gres ta tanda di ka sim bana chara chi ka su gore nimu ka su ani general ni khain sa ro ta gonda ni ka su khain sa ro ta ya gonda ni khela ka nge ka su chong song sa chi ro ka nge chong gu chanda tin ka ro chi chong song sa ge ya twa din yo res.
And we can look at some of those results. One moment.
Tanda nga su te la ya len ta chi gu tandi chi ta ya ro ti ta la chi ta ge yes.
And what we can see is this first question is, during the past 2 weeks, how many days did you sleep at some point during the day? And we can see that some people didn't sleep during the day, but most people usually slept at least once during the day.
Tanda ge twa tampo de ka system bala dewi ge don than ni ran la ya nima ko choro ni ta thong thong khu ya ge nima de ka chu chong song sa te res ade de ta ba im ban de mi kha shi chi nima ko de dus ne te me se mi mambo chi ane ka su ge de nima ko ni khu ba na ni chi thoma ni thong thong de thoma chi khu ya de chong dus.
So we also asked questions about behaviors that someone might do at night before they go to sleep.
Yeah, shenda nga su tro ka chi tro re system bala ya chi nga su mani ge ngwa la ro mani ngwa la ya lika do ka chi chi be se ti ge na tro ti na tro res.
And in this type of data, we're trying to sort of distinguish people who do something very often versus very rarely or not at all.
Ta ta de ka sim bana nga su ka tro re system bala ya tandang de ta chi lika de chu ra de ta chi yang si thoma mambo chi ge sa ta ya na thoma mambo chi me sa chi ro o ti ge tro ti ta yo res.
We also asked many questions about emotions.
And
we asked, during the last 2 weeks, did you feel this emotion not at all, or did you feel it a lot? And this is very similar to the study that Jenny talked about, where they were looking at sort of particular behaviors or feelings related to depression and asking how often people experience those behaviors or feelings.
So samnges and degree yishim basage or netan tetala ya ko deo kanda do chi do the shooting kanda do take do set it the do paris.
So what we can see is that what happens with these data, actually, is that when somebody fills out a survey, we collect all of the data from one participant.
That the Kapsunga so carriers and Michiki Watanda dig quote drug to show the combine by now. And Michiki Kansha Jugi to show the Kansha Jug Lankanza and Yampton to Slagiris.
And this is called a spreadsheet.
That de la spreadsheet Lanasugita that can't remove the which is.
So each of these is a row, and that represents everything that one person reported.
That not so part of by now to teach to teach the career system, but like this, I'm a Michiki Len Junsha Jutis.
And this is a column, and that's all the responses for a particular question.
That is my usually on tour was on to take another usually to a chila, Miss Hamagi, Len Junsha Jutis.
So, for example, this question is, how many times did you sleep during the day on average? And this person does not sleep during the day. But just by looking at this, we can see that most people who answer the survey sleep one time each day, which sounds very familiar if you think about Tibetan monastics. So in a moment, I'm going to give your groups an opportunity to look at this spreadsheet, but I want to just look at a few of the results. So we talked about that. So here we can see sort of that same data that we just looked at in what's called a pie chart. And the fact that most of the chart is red is because most of the people who answered the survey sleep one time each day. We also asked on average, how many minutes did you sleep each time you slept during the day? And here we have a histogram presenting those results. So in a histogram, we have number of people here, which is called the y-axis. And we see that about 11 people reported that when they slept during the day, they slept between 25 and 50 minutes. When we looked at sleep, if we're interested in sleep quality, sometimes you might ask how many times you have a hard time falling asleep or going to sleep at night.
아니 그 드라스틱 가르쳐요 레스 남발라 공다 니 비캅서 니 쿠야 카푸 정하기데 토마가츠 정송세 드라텐데 쳐요 레스
And the majority of people, 86% of people, rarely have had a hard time falling asleep at night in the last 2 weeks.
하단 데이비든 트라이니기린라야 공부 니비캅서 니 쿠야라야 칼리 카푸 정하세 쳐라데 미 페초라 텐데 정만도스 자차기 자차기 사실라야 정만도스
So I mentioned that we also asked questions on a number of behaviors like eating and sleeping. And we also sort of worked with the monastics at Emory to think about other things that you might do before you go to sleep.
아니 아무리라 유튜브에 아니 다좀 kusuला kichtride de yang shenda yang ko manyo la shenda jenda kare kare chiche yo me tu kola kichtride de ani chichupa kola ya tro kachi chitang yes.
So thinking about our discussion of Jenny's data, Dawa had mentioned that one of the questions that asked about sort of concentrating while reading a newspaper maybe wasn't relevant to a Tibetan population.
That another cause by Chikalana again Jenny Hansatribu cups and Narangi Samsi Shisha by Bana, Ishashana Jig, Topper Lock said over Tinado Picente Yanko, young Popagishkunala Yanko, Shirish and Drama to Picintinado Yan, Isvaris.
Whereas here we add a debate, which is very relevant to you. But if we ask students at Northwestern University, where Robin works, do you debate before you go to bed? They would think that was a very weird question.
Robin like Northwestern Hapranangle Hope Tree like Chumanya, Nitsubatsu embassy, the kitchen tripina, Churning draw Mechugi, and the Kupis on Trachi Charities.
I just like to say the only way I fall asleep is if I have a really good debate. So it's totally makes sense to me.
So looking at some of these data, we asked one question about during the past 2 weeks, how many nights have you eaten within 2 hours of going to bed? And most people, 70% of people, reported that they are rarely eating within 2 hours of going to bed.
That under the Capsa Chicaresis Tambalaya, Mania Mungi, Nigin in Lasaborata, to Mania Mulaya, and a Kala Samaside or Chiro, Gerardo Jim basis Tambalaya, and a judge of 2 page or any the Jim is those.
So with that, I want to actually hold on. Get out of this presentation. Oh, well, this is the data on debate. And what we can see is that this is one where we start to see some differences in the population of people who filled out the survey. Where about half of those who responded have not been debating much before bed in the last 2 weeks. And the other half have been debating a little bit or even a lot.
Zamske any ko dulantis this nawata any young kashim mampo nawat in the Jonshas.
So in terms of emotions, we asked, again, we sort of worked with the monastics at Emory to come up with a list of emotions.
And Amarilla Dr. Nangi and it has like kitchen data, those
And we included both negative and positive emotions. So on the negative side, we asked during the past 2 weeks, how often have you felt anxious?
단대대 가서 만나고 삼년 대양고 가서 지금 여가던 두번 차양고 주버지샤예스 단대대 가서 아티 anxious 방아수 삼색지 차지거와 어디기 니탄테 don탄이랑 같이 정성세로 되트리오레스티.
And the majority of people who responded said that they occasionally feel anxious, but they're not feeling anxious a lot over the last 2 weeks.
렌자니 페치하고 this 정성 마토페양고 망보지 정성 들으시기 두스.
On the positive end, we asked during the past 2 weeks, how often have you felt peaceful? And everyone who answered either said a lot or a little.
근데 단대들라야 주시대서 그러다 시시대와 되나도 가서 정성세 삼발만 주시기에 아니 망보 정성스도 아니 가시 지겠다 그 제시 시시스르다 되게 뜻 정성스도.
So you can see that when we look at these graphs, it's a bit easier to understand some of the results or see some of the patterns compared to when we just look at this big spreadsheet.
단단한 속에 뒤를 지어라 뒤를 된다라 다바이마이나 가서 좋아 당주 때라야 랭간다로지 렌도세 지어와 대다 지가 고알래야 당 통화들이 라우도 왔다 이 강기탄들이 라우도 시스템을 단단들라 가서 장투 리무 첨부시도가 내라 들바이마이나 지가 저 뒤르나 고샤주데 나그 슈칭가르로 시트도 제바가르로 주도세 대다 고알래라 리라우도 왔어.
So I want to take just a few minutes to get you to think about these data and sort of the interviews that you've done. Let me get to where I need to go. Oops, that's it. So in your groups, what I'd like you to do, we're going to spend the next 5 to 10 minutes. If you go to the classwork page, you'll see sort of a link to the pre-survey responses, which is the spreadsheet. And then what I'd like you to do is to think about sort of what you see, just sort of looking at that spreadsheet and what you see, there may be some interesting results or some things that are unexpected. And then what are some of the challenges of working with these data and with the interview data? So I'll give you about 5 minutes to talk about this or so, and then we'll come back as a big group.
단다 디카스 가르치긴 선에서 단다 고고디나 클래스룸만 로바이바이나 단다 게라게 장투 치단 소디 요레스 와다 단다 치수 가르치고레스나 장투 데이터 데이터라요 바제 아니 현대 치수게 쇼바데라에 밀라 젠드리 치치 드로틀렌치 탄샤요와 그러면 데이터 아니 냠티치 데이터와 아니 단다 하버드 장투 데이터라테네 데이터와 아니 가스고레 장투 데이터가 나나야 지금 삼루나 마크로 캔셋인데 정샤세 로치탄로 아디나나 지금 만라로디 간다가르로 지도 스와데 에양코 림지 양첨부스고 interesting result 가이도 아니 지금 삼루나 마템바기 된다고 가르치도 스와 아니 팀세 아니 가사 아니 단다 림지 다 장투 데이터라타 바이바나 인디 데이터라야 고이시치야라 강에 가르가리 로지 책도스 강에 가르가리치도 팀세니 현다 지 젠더 지주가 양치출라야 지요로 투지요로 데이터라야 고 지다 20제라 강에 가르가리치도 세티콜라야 니 루카나니 드드나로 치스 니 드드나야라야 칼마가도 주도지스.
That was great, Nicole.
Yes, gela ke kodo es koba ena lava eurojesa.
Yay! Okay, so you've now collected both some qualitative data through the interviews this morning and some quantitative data through these sleep surveys in terms of understanding people's sleep and how it may relate to their emotions and behaviors.
ane joa de tala lende palatine de tenga sola yam borse ge tangtu kachi jira yores ne shenda imbaina ane chichuge shopa mila chandri jiwa jiwa ra chandri jiwa talatine de tenga soge pije shibi tande ge tangtu kachi jira yores ta deta nga so karse gore ta ni ta tane samyong so gore samyong ta ne samkhan tan ro jugi gorgi joa kachi res.
So I would like somebody to give sort of a possible sort of challenge or limitation of these approaches for collecting data.
Oh,
go ahead.
Tanda chetsuna ni chikirwa di dinado dribi kapsirwa tanga su tangtu dinado chi dribi kaps ani ko kola ya chekka ranshin karichidu ani kola ya ani karsugurita kange do karichidu ti kola deshi jarchidas.
And it would be great to hear from somebody that we haven't heard from before.
Ani tanda tina ni labar terwa ani ngoma kamo nang meji chike kamo nana pe ya wachangsa res.
Kale tarang shop interview chiki da konjo sabe chisa ide ko kale tarjo chesa on this semyong tara da ko ni this
So Pasan, can you select somebody a sort of overview, a challenge or limitation?
Suimbe da nanda di challenges the groups mba
lenja di
Pazu that Chuating of Dilra, Pajati, that's someone that is on your dossier, dig it's not this doing.
Yeah, what he said is when you ask those questions that qualitative questions, do you feel like you don't feel comfortable asking people to reveal the secret?
So a benefit of the quantitative questions is not that we want to hear and we want to understand people, but oftentimes when we take a qualitative approach, it might be hard to sort of look across all of the data that we gathered and see a pattern. And with quantitative data, it may be easier to see that pattern.
Children banana sugarwa, the precision GB cups in banana sugar, Trochi Tangle, Troch Town by Banata, Lamambujragarwa, Lamampuchirayo becomes any that's all that Chiung shoot you Chabiag Nathan Kanachu Rido setting as a precision cups in this Toya Discali Caboyores. And as soon Borsa Shinji cups in banana, Borsa Shinji cups in banana, Yanko. But it
is true that with a qualitative approach, especially an interview approach, you as a researcher may learn things that you never would have asked.
Yeah, Nathan Tikas to a tribute capsule, Chamber Chibi capsule, Hamakoya, Nathan Tiladoya, how good in the answer is.
So what's one more sort of challenge or limitation of either the survey or interview data?
That and the young Shenda Chikir, what and the Chitsuge 양나가 속에 다토네 제집지지로 되게 당토되나니까 야무나 속에 전리지위기 렌치로 되달아야 고 강에도 가르가트 손대 지게 손로치다스 나치미식
다른 쪽으로 된다디 나도 파서 뒤가 당지 갑라니 다 데이비드 다와직 나로라고 임바는 다와직 뒤즈디 나로라니 다소스 뒤즈 가강에 가르스 버다 지 내주라고 가르 주마저 님하고 있다 당내심 하고 있다 되게 마찬 강해지어라 템바 세고 매죠지 어디 강해지 되기도 저가 당원디
Yeah, when we do the interview this morning, when we ask in the past month, so people have difficulties to remember the specific event or the difficulties they had to fall asleep. So it's kind of difficult to recall the event.
Yes, so this is one challenge of both of these approaches when we're asking humans questions, is that Calden mentioned earlier this morning that somebody might lie, but somebody may also just not have a good understanding or memory of events.
The Nishak Telaya Kangi Yopachiris, Chi Banakarisana, Dotina do Tribicas Michiki could Zun love cigarettes, Zun shares cigarettes, Chichibana, Shendachilaya, Yankola, Tigakola, Chambaya Pomaswache, Yanko, Lantina Doja, and Tilayan cigarettes.
And this explains why, sort of going forward, we may combine many approaches, including collecting sort of measures of what the body is doing while sleeping, or after meditation, or upon some behavior.
Tanda data latent data ko gendela kangi dinta yopa latent data de gala nga chu thablen shenda tinda khana ja chu wa isha shabana ko ni kubi kaps ani chi zu pu gone chi chenje de ro cheje ta ani yang ko cheje de yang picha shana chi gom jamnu bi jela yang ko ni kaps yang cheje ta yana shenda tinda dunu bi jela ya ani ni ku ko se yang zu pu gone cheje ji wa o te ta de ga thalun tinda yang tanda gi dinni kala yang khana che de yores.
So with that, I want to talk a bit about your sort of research projects and what you'll be doing tomorrow morning. So our goals for the project are to collect just a little bit of data so that you can practice doing a study, but that could also inform a larger study in the future.
심직 때 자첨부대라 펜트포인하기 warwa tinda 우체 때네 지 당토디 영역지들을 제 토미기 당토들을 제 대인스.
So tomorrow you'll actually design a study, and then over the next couple of days you will collect data, and then eventually you will present your results.
상해 가르치기를 해서 담발을 제쪽에 다시 그 심직대 철고지고요. 그래서 네 다시 심직대 철고지 아니 되게 제라에 니마 가시나들이 제쪽 가르치기를 해서 담발에 때라에 장투들부지 장투들부지는면서 네 장투들이 지와라 때는 데이터 템비 가르치 존슨 사이트 야 무트당 담시지고요. 그래서
So every group will design a study to assess how some behavior impacts sleep quality.
다시 수가 가리 딱시 가르로 지쳐고지고 그래서나다 루카리레레 공원이와 네 샤추 당 시추스가 더 쇼파당 쇼파 아니 지게 아니 닐라야 시친 트레도 사이치거와 딘다도 강라야 아니 딱시 지드부고요. 그래서
So I would like to get some ideas from people about behaviors that you think might impact sleep.
단다 제주가 나네 양 지가 저거 니라야 수진 때니게 주신다 주파서 그러다 시가 또 주파된다고 요바 니 가리가리 요사리 아니 제주공이 지송시됐어
그 그룹 시와
이 레전드는 다 통치배거라.
그래 exercise
이게요 아니 내가 직접 해봤더니 갈라 그러다 지 사마 몽부사 지사 뒤지네요. 직접 해봤던 줄 알았어요.
that's all yeah exercise could impact sleep also if you eat excessive food it also food also impact sleep.
Right. And if we think about exercise, we could ask a question about exercising right before bed, or we could ask people how much they exercise during the day in general. So there's many questions that you can ask. With eating, you could ask a question like we did on the survey. How often in the last 2 weeks did you eat within an hour before going to bed? Or we could do an experimental study where we have half of the group eat 25 momos before bed and the other not, and see how it impacts sleep.
마수가 계산 좋아하는 유치나 신처럼 데비든 천지랑라야 많이 뭔가 주치던 데라야 아니 지금 칼라사에게 이마 같이 총송세 된다로 지나들 거래 야만에 현대 가치나 그래서나 마수게 가서 딘센니라야 고셔져 딘센이라 고셔져 지게 네 딘센치로 가는 계속에 아니 뭐라야 몸은 스탱가 사지니야 바다 시 딘센 현대 되게 몸이 지가 마사니에 된다로 지제야 다시 지나들 거래서.
So tomorrow with your group, we'll try to come up with a really big list and then think about behaviors that you would be interested in studying.
또 상인 반에서 소소소 된생나라와 아니 지금 속에 니라야 수친 트레이닝이 아니 시가도 줘봐서 그러다 데이터 가리요 받는다 아니 지금 토치zo 되게 나네 목세게 지수 관계 지라야 아니 지금 특시 진이 주고도 대치 주게 네 땡케고 그랬어.
So once you know a behavior that you want to study, you'll need to decide how you're going to collect those data.
맞다. 지수게 때 가서 특시 진이 주야게 시초지거라 시초 때에는 이제 시초 되고도 세게 시초때 땡캐누고 제라야. 와. 땡캐누고 제라야 때단 드베게 아니 지탄토 간스드르지게 인사이트 간산탄 거였어.
So we can imagine that Robin and I could decide to do a study on whether having a regular walking meditation practice impacts sleep quality.
되게 로빈 당하라니 바이나코 딜라이토노 진이 주고도스타 비샤샤나 지 많이 응원라야 가속에다 두검석으로도 공부잡지 검자처럼 두검때 제바이나 되게 수진 간다라고 지적도 되고라야 다시 주고도스타 시제야 돼.
And we could do a descriptive study where we find a bunch of participants, and then we ask all of them through a survey about their meditation habits. Do they meditate a lot or do they meditate a little?
가리치아요레스 담발에 다시 신지지야 돼요. 단다기 대십 집지스도가 어디 십시지야 돼요. 레스티가 세바나 코슬라야 좋아 당에 담보텔라야 내가 속에 좋아 당대당 제집기 좋아지 당대당 갈세나 저 코스 갈수 그래다 검티 망로치 자그 가르도치 자그에서 코스 검자에게 검시텔라야 고알해져요레스.
And then we could ask them questions about their sleep or collect data about their sleep in some way.
네 그수 되게 제라야 그수가 니탄 데위기 좋아되나 다야다 니탄 데위기 장투 들을지야 돼요. 그래서
So in this case, our independent variable is their meditation habits, how often they do walking meditation.
또 단단 되게 니탄 되게 값은 아주 되메기 되메기 주탄틱 되메기 주시티카레스 담마는 두금티레스 그수 두금 망로이 자기 유세티레스.
And we may have many dependent variables, how long you sleep each night, how long it takes you to fall asleep, how you feel when you wake up in the morning.
네 값은 바나 아주 되지긴 주탄티 배 망보 요청을 비샤샤바이나 지가 니쿠야 되로 니랑로 그송 니쿠야라 카레 가수 창송 세도다 아니 쇼바 니세비 값은 아니 저런라 저런 간도로 지해송라 소바게 네고 되지긴 주탄티 망보 요청을
And ultimately, we can still within this sort of take all of those data and maybe break the participants into those who don't do walking meditation versus those who do walking meditation a lot, and compare our dependent variables.
다 단단히 그 타마텔라야 아니 나서 라 장투 망보지 라바티로 장투 라바티 아니 딘센이라제 데데 지금 조금 자니 유니 땅 자니기 딘센이라제데 아니 코로나니 바로 그 장투티 아니 지금 가서 펜스 들데데 시시제요레스.
Now, instead, Robin and I could decide to do an experimental study. So we could take a group of people, probably a smaller group of people, then we can just send out a survey to a bunch. And one group, we would have them do walking meditation 1 hour before bed, and the other group would not do any meditation before bed.
다 단단 데값에 디 뭐마티 차울라야 티 마이 바체 단다 로벤다 가라니가 가르치니 또 선스 스탄발라야 딱세기 지체치니 또 선스 딱세드니 또 선스 타틴 스탄발라야 아니 지금 이 딘센니가 나라야 미 딘센니라체 미게 딘센레레가 나라야 미탄테스 뇨뇨뇨니체 아니 딘센 치라야 아니 지금 루금디 자가 지금 현다til라야 루금 자가 마치가 되는 지인스.
And then here we have a very clear sort of comparison of sort of comparing sort of sleep in the people in each of these two groups.
안티 응알아야 두금 자야테 양고 마니에게 지금 올라 두금 자스고와 또 단단히 값인 바나 가서 저 두금 자니 땅 마자니가 바로라야고 가서 드르바인 바나 가서라야 드르야기 니탄티 카사부지 요레스.
Now, there's one more sort of experimental design that may be helpful for you.
다 현다 양아서게 딱세기 지금 그 청구지야 지거와 대양 현다 지금 심바지고 레스 지진에 되게 저서 펜토스 그레스.
So here, Robin and I are going to ask the same question. Does doing walking meditation 1 hour before bed increase sleep quality?
다 단데 가서 좋아지 가르치게 시스템 발라 많이 응은라야 아니 많이 응은 그 찍기 응은데라 아니 지금 조금도 잡아이나 조금도 두바이나 되게 저런 게 아니 아니기 지금 비과지로 어때라야 수신 책도 무두사에 자요레스 도와대.
But in this case, we'll have each person do the same thing. So on 2 days, they will do meditation, and 2 other days, they won't do meditation before bed.
다 데카센다 미 가노치 바나 코게테 드레테 치파치 드부요 레스피차샤나 니마니라야 마니응을라야 두금 자야체 난티게 질라 니마니라야 마니응을라 두금 마자야티다.
And then this time we'll collect data each of those days from that person.
단다 데카센 바나 다 나츠고 tanto 드르체테 니마 리리리신토 아니 tanto 드르치기인스.
In this case, everybody becomes their own control because we compare the days that they did meditation versus the days that they did not.
다 단단되게 내던 값이 바나 소소소소데 아니 당증을 과연 작아요레스 소소 당증을 가자고레스 가르스라나 아니 거기 니만일라야 곰 작아요 말와 니만일라 곰 작아요와 이스탄발에 소소소소데 当真给你当真给电线的价格是。
Now, I've been using the term measuring sleep quality, but we might want to think a little bit about what our dependent variables could be.
다 다들 값은 속에 지금 니기 비까지 지금 천재에서 저와 어디 지샤요 스타다디 값은 아주 가리 삼는 동안에 그래서나 지금 땅 아주 니 야부 쿠슨 쿠마송세 저와 디기 값은 아니고 지금 뒤지긴 줄 장치와 어디 간다도 지금 그래 되는 삼는 동안에 그래서.
So, in terms of sleep quality, we have looked at survey data and we looked at how long it took to go to sleep.
지금 단어 그래서 담발아야 니 쿠야라야 니 니누질라 니 쇼야라야 같이 좀 걸선 세대 단어 그래서.
How long you sleep.
And then your general queens at that analysis.
What would be some other things that we might want to measure to understand if somebody has very good sleep versus poor sleep?
The Shendang Asuga, the Capsule, Michela, New Shu Yabuchi Kusha set and Yabuchi Kumason set there, Nichi Senja, Laya Shenda, Karikari Senja, always.
So 신이 수. 자 그룹 대 개와 경화스.
Nilam ya botang matang di sejen dirat. Na nilam yang siang tang de wayna di ni tubu ko jiwa di yonggo maro. Da ni tubu ko wayna ngajo sugola yang ngiso tebela ke yore. Da ngajo ni tubu deep sleep yo. Ondi ke chimara sida.
That's all. Yeah, we can ask or measure if someone has deep sleep or not, or someone has frequent dreams or not. So with that, we can also quantify the quality of the sleep.
Frequent dreams is an excellent one because as we go further in both this workshop and in the program, we could see that we could do that by asking people. But we can actually also measure brain activity. Now, for your studies, we'll be doing it based on surveys and interviews, so you'll be asking people, but you're going to learn about how to sort of measure brain activity, and that might be something that we can do in the next phase of our research program.
China degrees, Shenda Tangaso, Lepig and Angishabu, 10 jetty, and a Jitsu motor chigres, and a Masuga Shibjiti, Rumba method to Rubina, which is to Jelaya, the 10 jetty, John the G tourists.
You could also ask somebody if they move around a lot while they sleep, or if they did the night before. But we can also measure that. And there's many more pieces of data that you could collect, but this is just a list to get you started as you design your studies.
다들 딩바나 세속에 지금 딱시 띠그 값을 당도 들으지야 되다 하자만 보지요레스 딩바나 단다 데라 가시 지트바데 양고 비춘 점 인스.
So finally, before we talk about tomorrow morning, I just want to mention that you can survey people about sleep quality in the last 2 weeks or the last month. And we've seen some data like that.
The Kasu Karchigan survey select Jechip, Jechip, the career system, but like Mitela, David, don't try in a in Laya, Yanda, David Dawash Green Laya, and you can do Johnson Sagi, and you could draw it on yours.
You can also interview people and ask them about their sleep experiences.
Tim Senish and the Mitela, Chenrichi, the Kosu, and Yitan David. But
another approach that sleep researchers do is they will have a survey so that as soon as somebody wakes up in the morning, they could get their phone and they could ask some questions about that night's sleep. And then one final thing that I think is very interesting is that for you, because most monastics are sleeping both during the day and the night, that you could do a study about daytime sleep as well. So this is what you will be doing starting tomorrow. So you're going to work with your group.
You
will either design a descriptive study or an experiment. And that study or experiment will ask a question about how some behavior impacts sleep. You can get members of another group to be your study participants, or especially if you're doing a big survey, you could do it with friends and family remotely.
Ani shenda churong jechip tinda draw which do jechip tinda do driba in bayana yang shenda tanda dila mechu shenda susu tokota nami tinda dola ya draw titus karsagota remotely less tambalaya ni tatuni chichi chora tinda nana dikores.
So tomorrow morning in your groups, you're going to decide on the question and your hypothesis and study design.
Ahanta sanye imbayna ro sanye shopate la ya chesuge draw karichi tangimbe tani 심지기 로아 다시 심지기 간다도 지기 지속에 장고지기 배더니 한국에 최적대 간다도 지배대 안에 상해 지수 쇼파나야레스.
And then tomorrow evening you'll briefly present that plan to our whole workshop.
근데 상해 본다에 바나 지속에 안에 수수로 칸안에 가르도 지체바대 안에 참말에 두스 못지고요. 레수수게 다시 심지기 철시가리요 바대 안에 못지고요레스.
So you'll need a couple of documents in order to do this, and I'll show you where those are now. But there'll also be many of the group leaders there and other people to help tomorrow as well. If you look in your group folders, which, oh wait, I do have them. You all have set of slides called research project design.
tanda delaya ani chitsulaya tanda di loktonyen rich yorwa delaya ani karsubra susugu leche chango se tegi chegu gi ani tanda loktonyen rich yes.
And this will sort of help you as you work through it, decide on a question and a behavior and your approach.
Ta tanda digi karila pent kore sana chitsugi chi shicho chi dam digi ani tilatene de ta shi chango chi gugarwa detala ya kanadu gurum masuna pon kanadu chin dugo yotela pengres.
And then once you're done with that, you will use this to add some information about your study for our whole workshop.
That digi jela ya ani digi na la ya chitsuge karsula na tandagi nga suga subjunction dugo yorwan digi kaps toxe simji kare chi chigin sa ten digi la ya ni trigu yores.
So what you will see in here is that each group has essentially a couple of slides. And here's an example for our Momo group. We have our names. We have a slide there for our research question, a slide for our study design. So here we say that we're going to do a descriptive study, and a slide of what kind of data we're going to collect.
Tanda dega lokto nyenri imba na lokto nyenri tiga na la chitsu roka re la imba na ya ko karsubri tiga na la ya chi parashu masona shokta masona kashi yogres ro tampo de la ya roka su imba che ani tiga je la ya ani chi simji tiga joa kare imba tane ko tiga simji tiga kandas chango chi imba ro chango te kandas drigi imba chango te che ani tiga je la ko tampo te kandas chi imba. And a
very important part of science is designing a study and then talking to other scientists about it so that by the time you do it, you have a really good approach.
Chango te ani charu pa shenda to nyam te trader chi jewa la tere de ni tong is so so ngone chi takshe shimji te dribya la ndru kapsin bana ani so so la takshe shimji te drya ge tablan apuchi ragres.
And so that's what we will do tomorrow. But right now, since we're studying sleep, we recommend that you go get some sleep.
That thing also go dribya te sanya drugi ins ro ani tanda sanya also go dribya te anything any go simjin so any tanda cheso any ka page any chipuch crotches.
Thank you so much. Sleep well, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Also tuchinas any chipuch crotches zumsa de sanin jayons.